So thank you for the introduction, and good afternoon or good evening already perhaps to everybody. So what I want to talk to you about is how the Estonian party system at the elections of 2023 looks like from the perspective of voters. How the ideological landscape looks like, where are the voters located, where are the parties located, and I want to end perhaps with a few thoughts about what the results would be tomorrow. But before I get to that, I want to talk a bit about the history of the party system, because to understand the situation now, we have to go a few years back. So I think the current phase in the Estonian party system began to develop about a dozen years ago. So in 2011, we had elections which gave us only a four-party parliament, which was quite an exceptional situation because 6 or more parties had been the norm previously. And not only did we have 4 parties in parliament, but one of the parties, the second biggest party in the system, the Centre Party, was kind of blocked from competition. So nobody was willing to cooperate with the Centre Party because of their controversial leader, Edgar Savisaar, first and foremost. So this pretty much meant that the Estonian party system back then, during that parliamentary term, from 2011 to 2015, was more or less absolutely dominated by the Reform Party. They were the only party that could form the government. They were the only party that could be the party of the Prime Minister. So I would say political competition in the party system was pretty much at a low point back then. Not many coalition options were possible. One party could set the tone of politics. And in parallel to that, quite a bit of discontent started to brew within the electorate, within civil society. So during this parliamentary term, from 2011 to 2015, we saw the emergence basically of 2 new parties. On the one hand, the Estonian Free Party, and on the other hand, the Estonian Conservative People's Party, EKRE, the party that we have been talking about today as well. And both of them were successful at the 2015 elections. Both of them entered parliament, so again, we had a 6-party parliament. But nothing big in the party system changed yet. Of course, there was a lot of controversy over EKRE entering the parliament, but let's say the ice did not start to move yet. But it did start to move in 2016 when the Centre Party changed leadership. So the old controversial leader, Edgar Savisaar, was replaced by Jüri Ratas, who is leading the party also now. And that meant that the party immediately became a viable coalition partner. The 2 smaller coalition partners of the Reform Party abandoned the Reform Party and immediately formed a coalition with the Centre Party. So the system became a lot more competitive overnight. And the Jüri Ratas government, which formed, it endured until the 2019 elections. And in parallel, what happened, like one of the parties which entered parliament, the Estonian Free Party, they slowly disintegrated. They were not able to start functioning as an organization, but EKRE slowly built up its support. It immensely increased its vote share by the 2019 elections. It entered parliament as the 3rd biggest party and was included in government, which again kind of produced a lot of controversy in the public sphere. And this controversy, let's say, has been brewing and building up in the kind of lead up to these elections as well. So basically, what we see now, what we see today is the end result of these developments and the whole kind of clash between the Reform Party and EKRE is kind of, let's say, the pinnacle of these developments. So where are voters located? So this is kind of a map which shows how the supporters of Estonian parties have moved on the ideological landscape. So on this figure, The horizontal dimension from left to right is a liberal conservative dimension, and the vertical dimension from bottom to top is the left-right dimension. Usually you see this the other way around. I switched the dimensions so that the more defining dimension would be on the horizontal axis. You see the parties, or the supporters of the parties, how they have self-identified and how they have moved on this landscape from 2016 until the end of 2022. And the circles kind of indicate the territories where the voters of these parties have been located at. And you see that, basically over the years, the landscape has spread out on the liberal conservative dimension. So the supporters of EKRE have slowly become more conservative in their self-identification. The supporters of Fatherland, Isamaa, have also become clearly much more conservative in their self-identification. And in parallel to that, we see that the supporters of the Social Democrats and the supporters of the Reform Party have become much more liberal in their self-identification. So we see how this, let's say, this competition or controversy between EKRE on the one hand and the Reform Party and the other liberal parties on the other hand has kind of stretched out the ideological landscape. And Fatherland and the Centre Party, they somehow, let's say, remain in the middle. And later, perhaps, if we talk about who could form a government, then these two parties are, let's say, parties which could basically move between the two blocks. These developments are also reflected in how, let's say, the supporters of different parties either like or dislike other parties. So this table, perhaps it's a bit hard to read, but just follow the colors. So the rows in this table represent voters of different parties, and the columns represent how much they like or dislike other parties. So the diagonal here is how much the supporters of a party like their own party. And all the other kind of cells in this table indicate how much a voter of a party likes or dislikes another party. So what kinds of patterns do we see here? So first of all, we see that, let's say, the self-identification of the two defining parties in the system, EKRE and the Reform Party, this is the strongest. They are the voters who like their own party also the most. What else do we see from here? You also clearly see how EKRE is, except for their own supporters, it's generally disliked. So blue indicates dislike, orange indicates like. So EKRE is pretty much disliked by the voters of all other parties. And they also kind of respond in kind. So EKRE voters pretty much dislike all other parties except their own, and Fatherland, another conservative party, is also a bit kind of appealing to them. And on the negative end of the, let's say, the emotional spectrum, we see that the Reform Party voters very intensely dislike EKRE, and EKRE voters very intensely dislike the Reform Party. And it's a bit asymmetrical as well, and you see that the Reform Party voters hate EKRE a bit more than the voters of EKRE hate the Reform Party. And this is actually a pattern that you see in other party systems as well. So populists are hated a bit more than they hate the rest. So this is kind of an interesting asymmetry that you see across different countries. And you see it, well, here in Estonia as well. And this, let's say, this affective polarization is something that you, if you follow the campaign and if you follow what people and how they talk about politics, this is something that you can kind of really see and really feel. And I think that this is this kind of emotional response to politics and different responses to the supporters of different parties, you see it more and more in everyday life as well. So going more to these elections. So what I want to show you here, I was part of developing a vote advice application for one of the daily newspapers, Postimees. And this vote advice application not only does it give voters kind of a chance to find their most preferred party or most preferred candidate, it also gives us a lot of information about how the political landscape looks like. So this vote advice application is candidate-based. Basically, it means that all candidates who run at these elections were given a chance to fill out a set of questions which were more, let's say, about their general values and principles rather than particular political issues at these elections. And after they had filled this out, this survey was also opened to voters. They could fill out the same questionnaire, and the application would basically give them kind of an indication of what their closest or furthest away candidates were in their particular electoral system. So this is how it kind of benefits the voters, but it also, let's say, benefits us because we know now where the voter or where the candidates stand politically, and therefore where also the parties stand politically. And not only that, because a public opinion survey using these same questions was carried out in parallel to when the vote advice application was launched, we also know where the voters generally are located. So on this map, basically, we see the voters or the distribution of voters. This is the kind of gray dots in the background. We see where the average politician of each party is located on an ideological landscape, and with the small dots, and we see where the average voter of each party is located on this ideological landscape with the large dots. So this is kind of like the standard left-right, liberal, conservative ideological map. So left-wing, economically left-wing positions are on the left, economically right-wing positions are on the right, socially liberal positions are down, and socially conservative positions are up. And we basically see that, there are, first of all, there are voters all across this ideological landscape. On average, the average voter is a bit to the left and a bit conservative, but quite to the center. The average politician is also quite to the center, but it's a bit more right-wing and a bit more liberal. But if we see or if we look at how the parties and the party supporters are kind of distributed here, we see a few interesting patterns. So first of all, the supporters of parties are always more to the center than the candidates of these parties. So candidates are always a bit more, let's say, extreme, a bit more liberal, a bit more right-wing, or a bit more conservative, or a bit more left-wing. So this is kind of the first pattern which emerges. The second pattern which perhaps we see is that, like voters, both candidates and supporters of parties are pretty much kind of evenly spread across the whole ideological landscape. The center party is on the social liberal conservative dimension fairly to the center and a bit to the left. On the economic dimension, their candidates or politicians are much more left-wing than their voters. EKRE is clearly conservative on the social dimension, left on the economic dimension. Fatherland, their candidates tend to be right-wing, but their voters slightly left-wing. The Greens and the Social Democrats, both we see in this liberal left-wing quadrant. The average Reform Party supporter is quite centrist economically, but their candidates are fairly right-wing. Estonia 200, also here quite close to the Reform Party. One of the newcomers, perhaps this is maybe the most interesting feature on this landscape, the right-wingers, or those on the right, which were also mentioned before, one of the new parties which tries to enter parliament now, they try to define themselves kind of very clearly as a right-wing party. And they also succeeded. I mean, their candidates are on the left-right dimension, extremely right-wing. But the bad thing is that, as you see, almost no voters are there in that region. So they perhaps define themselves a bit far to the right, and I would say this is maybe one of the reasons why they are kind of struggling now to gather support, because in Estonian politics there are simply no voters who are as right-wing as their candidates are. So this is kind of like how the ideological landscape, or one way of looking at the ideological landscape of these elections is. And perhaps let's end with kind of a few words on polls. So this is kind of a short overview of how the support for different parties over the last 2 months has developed and what's their position in the run-up to the elections. As Annika mentioned, there's been a lot of controversy about polls, especially during this week. Different polling companies show different results, and often the kind of the gaps between the results are considerable. But there is one thing that I think all of them pretty much agree on, and this is that the Reform Party has quite a comfortable lead, and that they will most likely win the elections, or almost certainly win the elections. Their support perhaps has been dropping a bit, according to these polls over the last few months, but all signs show that they will do their kind of usual election result of around 29%. Even although the very latest, or some of the very latest polls show that they have gained a bit of support over the last week. The support for EKRE has been hovering somewhere between 20 and 25%. Of course, 25% for them would be quite, let's say, or unrealistically optimistic. I think they have pretty much exhausted their pool of support. Everybody who is likely to support them already is a voter of EKRE, and there are not many people left for whom EKRE would be the second choice. And there are a lot of people for whom they are completely unacceptable. But it's currently, as things are now, it seems that they will get slightly above 20% of the vote. The Center Party has lost a bit of support in the 4 years since the last elections. In the run-up to these, they've been kind of growing slowly towards 20%, but it's unlikely that they will get that high, so their support is most likely to remain somewhere just below 20. Estonia 200, the newcomer, they have been doing better at polls. By now, their support, I would say, is roughly around 10%. The very latest polls from this week show that they've gotten a small boost in popularity, so they're likely to get above 10%, but not much, I would say. And then the last two parties to enter the parliament, Fatherland and the Social Democrats, both of them are likely to get somewhere around, I would say, 8 or 9% of the vote. The Greens, so 5 indicates here the electoral threshold. The Greens and the right-wingers, both of them are way below the electoral threshold, and I would say that the most realistic goal for them is to reach this 2% level, which would guarantee them a certain amount of public funding until the next elections, when they can regroup and try again. So I guess from my part, this is it. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Martin. Now some questions. Yes, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. Which is the number, the percentage of undecided at the moment, let's say, I don't know, today or last week before the elections?
Well, this differs again a bit across polling companies, but it's pretty much in the range of what it was at the last elections, so around 35%, maybe a bit more. Sorry? The result can be surprising? I don't believe in surprises too much.
So it's more like the divergence of different opinion polls, which we're seeing over the recent days. I guess those who are undecided are more likely not to go to polls to polling station anyway.
Yes, and for these opinion poll numbers, they have been kind of taken out of the equation. So if a person says that they don't know who they will vote for, they are considered as a non-voter because chances are that they will not end up voting. But yeah, but what is true is that there has been quite a bit of divergence, for example, for how different polls have predicted, for example, the support of EKRE now. So there have been polls which show that it's around 25%, and there have been polls which show that it's around 15%. And this has created quite a bit of confusion over the last week. But I mean, some of this confusion, I think, can be settled if you look into how certain kind of, let's say, sampling methodologies differ across the polling companies. Some of this divergence is statistical chance, but this is another story.
How's the polling done in terms of, is it done over the internet? Is it done by landline? Is it done by cell phone, man on the street, sort of, and then what's the margin of error usually for the polls?
When Corona hit, I think all polling companies stopped doing face-to-face interviews. So by now, everything is done either over the internet or over the phone. The polling companies differ in terms of how much either of these two approaches they use. So some use 2/3 over the internet, 1/3 over the telephone for their party polls. Others use almost completely the telephone and only a small proportion over the internet. And this also, I think, determines some of the differences that we see. The margin of error depends on sample size, and now in the run-up to the elections, polling companies differ. Some base their results on a sample of 800, some 1,600, some on a sample of 4,000. So this gives, let's say, a margin of error of, let's say, ranging from maybe plus minus 4% to plus minus between 1 or 2%.
Yes, please.
Do you have any legal regulation regarding to the exit polls?
Exit polls?
Yes.
No.
Can anybody do it?
These are not, you mean polls done on the election day at the polling stations? I mean, these, as far as I know, they're not regulated, but nobody does them anymore because e-voting and early voting make it rather pointless, because less than half of people will go to the polls on election day, and your exit polls will not tell you anything.
Yeah, well, maybe just to add that internet voting is the most popular among Reform Party, which is the government party, and then EKRE is very much against internet voting, considering that it is not secure and not trustworthy. It's very difficult to organize any kind of exit polls, but there's no restrictions, no limitations on if someone wants to do it. Some more questions?
Yes, please, if I may.
Yes, please.
Yeah. Must a sociological company publish who pays for the poll, for the survey? I mean, someone pays for the survey to be conducted. So this company, sociological company, they show who is the orderer?
No.
Thank you.
Some more questions? Yes, please.
Thank you for your interesting presentation. I have some questions about the threshold. Here I am.
Okay.
Since when do you have a threshold? Because I'm from the Netherlands, we do not have the threshold. And if you would not have it in the current political circumstances, would you think this would be possible to introduce it? And maybe I'm asking for a political statement, but how important is the threshold in terms of governance, in terms of being able to govern the country?
Well, we have a threshold of 5%, so only parties who crossed 5% nationally. Since when? Since the beginning. I mean, there has been some discussion over whether this should be there or not. Smaller parties are always in favor of lowering or abolishing their threshold, but that's because they want to get in more easily. But from the perspective of how the system functions, I think it's fairly reasonable that it is there. I mean, otherwise, like the system that we have now, on average, guarantees that we have, let's say, 6 parties in parliament. 6 parties in parliament means that there's, let's say, a reasonable amount of turnover in governments so that the governing process doesn't become too hectic. If we would have no threshold, instead of 6, we would have 8, 9, maybe 10 parties in parliament, and in a situation where there are many different coalition combinations and 1 or 2 kind of votes from this or that party or seats from this or that party can determine the coalition, I think, you know, this would make the system undesirably unstable.
Yeah. Some more questions? Yes, please.
Just curious, I'm from Latvia. The previous parliament, we had a very surprising situation when so many parliament members changed so they left their original parties from where they were elected, and it is a really huge number. If I remember, 27, really so much. Do you have also the same experience that in existing parliament jumping, okay, they cannot change a fraction, but they are leaving and the party is a fraction?
Let's say maybe 1 or 2 MPs per parliamentary term to do that. So not much. And we have rules in parliament which kind of make it, let's say, prohibitive. So you're allowed to form a parliamentary group only on the basis of people who were elected from the same electoral list. And if you leave a parliamentary group, you cannot form another one. So you're kind of stranded as a non-affiliated member of parliament, and you lose, let's say, some privileges. And this, for example, kind of prohibits, to some extent, this kind of movement between factions or faction splitting and so on.
It was a kind of big issue in 1990s, I guess, and after that there were more and more restrictions foreseen in the Parliament Procedure Act, and now currently I think it's just those 2 per 4 years who changed their party affiliation in the Parliament. They of course they can't be formally members of the new faction, but informally they take part in the new party's faction and work. Yeah, I think we have to stop here for a coffee break for 20 minutes and then come back. Thank you.
Thank you.